So, a woman with Alzheimer's brought me to this pursuit of trying to understand why women are at greater risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. I was a postdoctoral fellow at Rockefeller University and had the good fortune to be a blind basic science observer on a clinical trial in women. And one of those women was staying at the hospital on the Rockefeller campus. And I would go and see her in the evenings and take a walk with her along the long esplanade of the Rockefeller campus. And she would regale me with stories of Adler and Jung and Freud. She was an Adlerian psychologist, and the feuds between, Jung and Freud, and then Adler and Jung. And one evening, I took her back to her room, and I bid her good night. And I closed the door and waited 30 seconds. I knocked and entered, and I asked, "Dr. Ansbacher, do you remember me?" And she was so lovely. She said, "I'm so sorry. Should I?" She could not remember me for 30 seconds, and I've remembered her for over 30 years. And in that moment, that one woman with Alzheimer's disease transformed the career and focus and life of one neuroscientist, one woman neuroscientist. And I have devoted my life to understanding why women have a greater lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease. So that's my origin story. So again, coming back to understanding why women are at a twofold greater lifetime risk of developing Alzheimer's disease, and that has been the real focus of much of our research. And the outcomes of that research have shown that it's not because women live about 4 years longer than men. It's because the disease can start earlier in women during the menopausal transition. That menopausal transition can unmask a risk of developing Alzheimer's disease later in life. And our work has shown that menopausal transition can actually be a transition in the brain, and how the brain, well, we know that the menopausal transition is a brain transition. And the impact of the loss of estrogen on the brain during this menopausal transition can have long-lasting adverse consequences for brain health in some women, not all women. In the female brain, estrogen promotes the utilization of glucose to generate energy. I call estrogen the queen of Darwin. She has left nothing to chance. So estrogen promotes the uptake of glucose into the brain and the conversion of that glucose into energy, or ATP. The loss of estrogen during the menopausal transition can induce a crisis in the brain because there's about a 20% reduction in glucose metabolism in the brain. And that is sufficient to activate a starvation response. And that starvation response is to utilize an auxiliary fuel, which is the standard, glucose deprivation response, utilizing an auxiliary fuel. The problem is that that's supposed to be a short-term response, not a long-term response. Now, what is the fuel that the brain will utilize when it's deprived of glucose? Again, this is not 100% deprivation. It's about a 20% deprivation. And what the brain does is utilize an auxiliary fuel that will generate another fuel that it can use, ketone bodies. The difficulty with that kind of response to use an auxiliary fuel is that ketones are generated from lipids. And you'd think, well, that's great. I have lipids to spare in different parts of my body. It doesn't utilize those lipids. It utilizes the lipids that are close at hand, which are in the brain. The brain is the most lipidated organ of the body. And those lipids enable and build the circuitry of the brain that allows for fast communication across vast numbers of neurons in the brain. And that's called the white matter, and it's made up of a lipid called myelin. Well, what the brain will do is utilize that lipid, myelin, to now convert it to ketone bodies, to go through an entire conversion process from lipid to ketone bodies to fuel that starving brain. Now, you can imagine that that might, in fact, have adverse consequences for the brain and cognitive function, like fast synaptic connectivity, fast synaptic transmission, that you need for when you're trying to do complex tasks, when you're trying to solve a complex problem, when you're trying to communicate across, a breadth of knowledge. And what I call that kind of decrement in those capacities is the whatchamacallit syndrome, where recalling information becomes more challenging, recalling that name becomes more challenging, when, thinking fast on your feet becomes challenging. It's the whatchamacallit syndrome that many women can experience. So that decline in cognition, cognitive capability, is not earth-shattering. There are workarounds. It is indicative, however, that the brain has undergone a transition in the ability to convert glucose into energy and is now utilizing auxiliary fuels. Now, just a reminder, the brain is the most energetically demanding organ of the body. The brain is 2% of body weight, but consumes 25% of the energy. So from here down, we're a Prius. From here up, we're a Hummer. So depriving the brain of about 20% of glucose utilization in the brain is a challenge for the brain. So estrogen, I call the queen of Darwin. She has left nothing to chance. Estrogen promotes the ability of the brain to convert glucose into energy. It also keeps inflammation under control, and it promotes the vascular health of the brain. And all of that leads to fast synaptic transmission, great cognition, and great problem solving. So when we think about the actions of estrogen, it's key to remember that estrogen promotes brain health. It does not reverse brain disease, right? So it's all about sustaining and promoting brain health. The introduction of estrogen much later in life, following the menopausal transition, is quite controversial and results in controversial outcomes. So part of what I encourage women to consider is during the menopausal transition, when women are having hot flashes, when they're experiencing fatigue and kind of cognitive challenges, that's the time to consider menopausal hormone therapy, not years after the menopausal transition has been completed. Because when you think about, menopause as a neurological transition, well, it's like puberty, right? We think of puberty again in terms of sexual reproduction, but the principal organ controlling sexual reproduction is the brain. The brain is that reproductive control center. And just like with puberty, the brain is very active in bringing on all those neural circuits that regulate reproductive capacity, both in women and men. And in menopause, now there's a dismantling of that system. And that is controlled by the brain. So the brain is quite active in these reproductive transition states. Now, let's think about the timing of menopausal hormone therapy. When is the optimal time? And the optimal time for menopausal hormone therapy is when women are having menopausal symptoms, the most common of which is the hot flash, but can again be sleep disruption that wasn't present before. Could be the emergence of depression. It could be the emergence of anxiety, right, with this menopausal transition, because all of those functions are again controlled by the brain. And there's this interplay between multiple systems in the brain that estrogen regulates. So estrogen promotes this learning and memory system of the brain quite extensively. It also promotes the areas of the brain that maintain good mental health, right? So that's in part why the loss of estrogen can be associated with the emergence of cognitive challenges and potentially depression or anxiety or mood disorders. So that's why I would like to see women consider menopausal hormone therapy for menopausal symptoms at the time of the menopause and not later. The ApoE genotype is well known to be a risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I want to emphasize it's a risk factor. It's not an absolute factor. So interestingly, we did a study in which we investigated in a group of about 450 women, all healthy. No one had, kind of diagnosed disease. They were all menopausal. And what we found is that within this group of healthy women, there were women who were at risk for type 2 diabetes, or at risk for high blood pressure, or at risk for high cholesterol. So they were in the normal range, but they were on the wrong end of normal, right? So their fasting blood glucose was on the high side. Their blood pressure in the normal range, but on the high side of normal. Women who had high cholesterol on the high side of normal. And what we found is that in those women who were on the high side, many of them were ApoE4 carriers. So they carried the risk factor for Alzheimer's disease. And I want to emphasize that the ApoE4 gene is a risk factor. And it's good to know your ApoE genotype, because that's information that you can manage, right? So all of these women who were on the high side of normal and who were also ApoE4 carriers, now they're in the normal range, but they don't have the freedom to actually tip over. So what about controlling that blood glucose or that blood cholesterol, and certainly that blood pressure, right? So seeing a physician, and there are dietary interventions for sure, but if dietary interventions don't manage that condition that's on the high side, then introducing a low dose of a therapeutic that manages either blood glucose concentrations or blood pressure or cholesterol might be a consideration that women can now make to reduce that risk when they've done everything, kind of in the lifestyle realm that they can. Now, that little extra boost where they can reduce that factor that's a risk factor and bring it now into the normal range. Because when we saw that was the case, it wasn't that the ApoE4 carriers were an absolute, for developing Alzheimer's disease. They just happened to be frequently on the high side of normal. So I would encourage women to engage in that precision medicine approach with your caregiver, with your physician, your health professional, to now get that ApoE genotype done and now have that knowledge so that you can now manage to maintain and your risk to sustain your health, your brain health and body health. I am thrilled to be a member of the Coalition for Women's Brain Health. This is a group of women, scientists and clinicians, who have joined forces to work collaboratively across disciplines, across institutions, across the world to bring women closer to perfect health. In this case, brain health. But brain health definitely impacts body health.